Skewing the Picture by China Miéville. A novelist and his pears. In Ishtarhall, the skin yard, bats on the bottle, rescuing the past. Aunt Emily goes to St. Kilda, duping the cuckoo people of the land. A Cotswold rarity, the road to the workhouse. That titleless poem is from 1953. This essay about framing is framed by several such poems, all taken from the same sequence, all undersung texts from the late 1940s and 1950s that, in an old modernist dialectic, deploy estrangement the better to strain for the real. To engage, in their case, with the pastoral and with the picturesque with which it is imbricated. That sequence will be a fracturing mirror. You know the picturesque when you see it. Higgledy-piggledy, a winding country path, overhanging hedgerow, tumble-down cottages. You can point at it, and sometimes that's the best you can do, because when you try to define it, it becomes evasive. That disinclination to settle into meaning is constitutive of the category. One of its founding theorists, Uvedell Price, in his 1794 essay on the picturesque, gropingly describes it as an uncertain idea of some character, which was not precisely beauty, but the cultural importance of the picturesque, insists Stephen Copley and Peter Garside in The Politics of the Picturesque, stands in direct proportion to the theoretical imprecision of its vocabulary. You know it when you see it. The word, pilfered from the Italian pittoresco, has at its heart the likeness to a picture, pictureness. The picturesque is the framing and formulation of a landscape, and it inheres in the gaze. Not precisely beautiful, but pretty, charming, scenic. But inextricable from the picturesque is a counter-tradition, exemplified by that nameless poem. It manifests, too, in a plethora of more overt and less restrained examples. It is not a contradiction to the picturesque, but its bad conscience. A Year in the Country is a project of searching for an expression of an underlying unsubtleness to the English bucolic countryside dream, an exploration of an otherly pastoralism. From this comes a book, discordant and terrifying albums, entirely constructed from sounds of the hinges of a front garden gate, the furniture of the picturesque repurposed to provoke unease. The video game, Sir, You Are Being Hunted, is set in what it calls the spooky countryside, where the figures of the traditional rural picturesque have become predators, scarecrows, huntsmen, landowners. Its occasionally labored steampunk kookiness can be underwhelming, but its soundscapes and its ab-pastoral uncanny landscapes are genuinely unsettling, digital crepuscularity skewing the randomly generated picturesque. The 1980 episode of Hammer House of Horror, Children of the Full Moon, opens with a slow pan of the picturesque imagery, a gnarled tree, undergrowth, dense flowers. A child sings, all things bright and beautiful, as she strokes a lamb. She turns to camera, and we see her blood-smeared face. She has torn out the animal's throat. A heavy-handed horror bait-and-switch subversion of the picturesque. There are examples beyond number. More hammer, like the 1966 village horrors, The Reptile, and The Witches, that Maypole nightmare, The Wicker Man, of course, several of the ghost stories of M.R. James, such as The Uncommon Prayer Book, set as it is in a highly picturesque area, those strange pastorals of the filmmaker Ben Wheatley. The most disturbing moments of Peter Strickland's extraordinary 2012 meta-horror, Berberian Sound Studio, are snippets from an imagined documentary about the English Downs, visited by tourists, bucolic Englishness made uncanny by their and our gaze. This bad picturesque works by skewing the framed scene, the picture of which the esque is expression. It mispronounces the terms of the picturesque, so let mispronunciation give it a name. This is the picture skew. The picture skew is one element of a whole fabric of affect and aesthetic, brilliantly outlined by Robert Macfarlane in his work on the English Eerie. There is a slippage between uncovering that eerie as an existing aesthetic in various works, expounding it as a methodology of reading in other, perhaps less overt or obviously so inflected, works, and as a potential artistic practice itself. That is neither unusual nor criticism. It is part of what can make such paradigms rich. The same is true, for example, not unrelatedly, of post-Derridan hauntology, deployed as it has been in music criticism and in music. And historically it is true of the picturesque itself, which was, from its 18th century birth, an unstable negotiation between a theory of aesthetics and an aesthetic style. Each iteration of this post-English eerie fits its own moment. Now, in this anguished Anthropocene, we might expect waves of what the poet Joyelle McSweeney calls the necro-pastoral, a political aesthetic zone in which the fact of mankind's depredations cannot be separated from an experience of nature which is poisoned, mutated, aberrant, spectacular, full of ill effects and affects. It is telling that McSweeney focuses on the pastoral. There will, concomitantly, come to be more and more mutation and death in the picture skew, too. The discussion here is mostly addendum to McFarlane's, and predicated on one of few points where of respectful disagreement. Because he writes of M.R. James that landscape is never a smooth surface or simple stage set, there to offer picturesque consolations, and calls the eerie a counter-narrative to the recognizable traditions of the picturesque and the pastoral in British place art. But to suggest that its consolations hold is to take the picturesque at its own unconvincing word. That very claim is what the picture skew rebukes. The rural eerie is not precisely coterminous with the picture skew. There are unquiet landscapes that are more and less picturesque, more and less picture skewed. But not only is the picture skew a sub-tradition of that eerie, but it is a centrally important one. And its categories spread like the filament of mycelium. Any genealogy of the picture skew needs one for the picturesque itself. In 1792, William Gilpin, in 3 essays on the picturesque, ruminated on that kind of beauty which is agreeable in a picture, for which neither of the two aesthetic categories offered by Burke in 1757 quite worked. It was not the pleasing, relaxing beauty based vaguely on smoothness, nor did it fit with the opposed term, that favorite of the Romantics, the sublime, a sheer vastness-provoking awe, if commingled with pleasure, of which Burke says, terror is in all cases whatsoever the ruling principle. It was between those two, said Gilpin, in perfectly composed images of rolling hills, tangled trees and rivers and cottages, was the picturesque. After Gilpin came Richard Payne Knight and Euvdale Price, John Ruskin, and others, through the centuries, developing that seminal post-Burke take. For Gilpin, the picturesque, unlike that smooth, beautiful, was variegated, broken, rugged, rough. And nature needs help. Composition is its weak point. Gilpin therefore instructs the reader in how to locate the gaze. Favor low viewpoints. Direct attention not from a godlike, sublime vantage down, but up. And where nature lets you down, change it in your representation, and make picturesque with artifice. Do not be restricted to a painted survey, a mere map. Deem not art defective which divides, rejects or recombines, but rather say, 'tis her chief excellence. For all its agreeableness, its charm, Gilpin knows that enabling and underlying that picturesque gaze are startling dreams of violence. A piece of Palladian architecture may be elegant, but if we introduce it in a picture, it ceases to please. Should we wish to give it picturesque beauty, we must use the mallet instead of the chisel. We must beat down one half of it, deface the other, and throw the mutilated members around in heaps. And central, too, to the picturesque, alongside such brutality, is Englishness. In point of fact, Dora Wiebenson and others have shown how much the concept was influenced by the writings and garden designs of France. And the very Englishness of the picturesque does not mean the concept does not, and did not always, have wider application and resonance. Ruskin located the quality in French cottages and in Venice. It has long been globalized. But it was first systematically developed in Britain, if often by Scots, and associated both as theory and style, including by continental writers, with England. The association was deliberately propagated. That sense still informs us. The picturesque is, somehow, defining of an English pastoral, of Constable's Haywain, of little villages, of the poem's Cotswold rarities. Picturesque has been a propaganda of the English imaginary, a cloying scent lingering around Albion like honeysuckle around a cottage door, inextricable from the Englishness of the mind. The sight, as Stanley Baldwin had it, of a plough team coming over the brow of a hill, the sight that has been seen in England since England was a land. It is key, too, to a mooncalf socialist patriotism. Orwell's old maids hiking to Holy Communion through the mists of autumn morning are its most famous evocation from his egregious socialism and the English genius. But in his paean to smoky towns and winding roads, green fields and red pillar boxes, he outlines exactly that undulating, rough variety of the picturesque. As Western people go, the English are very highly differentiated, he says, describing their knobby faces, their bad teeth. There is that variety and roughness again, now not only in the landscape, but in the English themselves. Here they are picturesque people, and Orwell's is a socialist picturesque. The picturesque is all these things. It remains an organizing principle, at work in cities no less than in the country, not uncontested by any means, but with real bureaucratic, institutional, ideological power. The modern urban picturesque flowered after World War II, over drinks in the Bride of Denmark, in Queen St. Anne's Gate. It was a densely, lavishly decorated place, all engraved mirrors and trompe-l'oeil murals, brewers' posters, a turtle shell. It contained a tatty stuffed lion, self-consciously self-effacingly English reference to a self-conscious, self-effacing post-imperial Englishness, though not nearly post-imperial enough. The Bride of Denmark was not, in fact, the public house it was designed to resemble, but a private club. It was a pub, the dream of a pub, a meta-pub. At the time of its construction in 1946, it was made to look always already smogged by decades of cigarettes, and brimmed with donated bric-a-brac and salvage from bomb sites. Those mutilated members around in heaps, repurposed as preemptive nostalgia, designed and made by Hubert de Cronin Hastings, Hugh Casson, James Richards, Nicholas Pevsner, and other stalwarts of the journal Architectural Review. There, as post-war blinking began, in that constructed picturesque of English conviviality, they constructed another picturesque, a new urbanism that, riffing on landscape, they called townscape. They conceived of it as a theory of liberty against authority, of English individualism and variety. Townscape was, explicitly, a gently modernist urban extension of the picturesque. In the 1949 editorial that was as close to a manifesto as it got, Hastings drew on Uvedal Price to argue that picturesque was radical. Repudiating aesthetic totalitarianism, it abjured grandiose foreign vistas or plazas for an emergent order of agreeable, moderate gallimaufry. A domesticated surrealism of quirkiness, all combined with what one practitioner called the scenic use of existing buildings, a respectful continuity with the past. As Richard Williams has argued, it retained the detached aristocratic viewpoint of the picturesque, wherein even labor is a spectacle. The mode of vision it proposed is one of privileged play. In an astonishing passage from Gordon Cullen's The Concise Townscape from 1961, buildings are imagined as bourgeois guests at a polite dinner party at precisely that point where they are not too drunk, but just drunk enough to play that privileged play. Out of the straitjacket of orthodox manners and conformity, real human beings begin to emerge. Miss X's sharp but good-natured wit is just the right foil to Major Y's somewhat simple exuberance. And so on. It begins to be fun. Conformity gives way to an agreement to differ within a recognized tolerance of behavior. It begins to be fun. Picturesque encourages a mannered eccentricity, a certain naughtiness, within limits, of course, all the better to reinforce the social order. bats on the bottle, as the poem has it, of those veering night flyers, rescuing the past. Which rescue of the past brings us to Poundbury. Poundbury, in the outskirts of Dorchester, is a toy town for Prince Charles. Here his architectural views have been given rein. It is an unashamedly traditional, low, zoning-free faux Georgiana of carless dream alleys and not-too-high towers, a market town fantasia. That the market hall design was sponsored by a millionaire greetings card entrepreneur seems a bit on the nose. Poundbury, a regular target of critical scorn, in Stephen Bailey's words, a sterile, suffocating dormitory town, the furniture floor of a provincial department store in 1954 translated into architecture, fake, heartless, grimly cute, is ground zero for anyone who doubts the picturesque's concrete, lived, authoritarian reality. The paths are gravel for appearance's sake, for the sake of the picture. That gravel spreads and is a nightmare for pushchairs does not matter. Many of the 25-year-old exteriors of Poundbury have been constructed with fake bricked-up windows, emulations of the real avoidance mechanism dating from the 1696 window tax. In Poundbury, strict rules disallow illuminated signs or clothes dryers, aerials, meters, air extractors, ventilation openings, dustbins, solar cells being visible from the street. And yet, here are unwindows, a facile and putrid kitsch homage to a devastating, unsanitary, and hated repressive measure that condemned people to unventilated darkness, is a tasteful detail. Here, the bad picturesque lives, or at least is undead. Another from the sequence, 1952, Skewing the Picture. Christmas. Postman Mouse, watching the mapmaker, trials of a barnstormer. Poor men's flowers, schoolhouse ghost. Rook parliaments taking risks with food, bees and their scents. A Persian half-hour. In the winter, the snow comes down, and looks momentarily lovely as snow always does, pretty as a picture. But try to clear it away, as infrastructure demands, and that recalcitrant gravel comes with it. Such are the mapmaker trials of the Poundburian, living in notionally, civically, educational simulacra, haunted by unease. Poor men's flowers, schoolhouse ghost. That unease has always been there, just as the picturesque has always been contested. Any invocation of it, even by an adherent, has to involve apology. Townscape, said Hastings, must rescue the picturesque from the frivolous embroidery with which it had become associated. Turn to definitions. The picturesque is visually attractive, especially in a quaint or charming way. How damning with such very faint praise. The same terms recur. Delightful, pretty, lovely, pleasant, scenic, charming, quaint. Say picturesque, and what you bring forth is chintz, China shepherdesses, and chocolate boxes, in at least as much quantity as tumble-down styles and rolling hills. Those distasteful poor men's flowers to which the poem adverts have long been visible amid the more successfully artful undergrowth. It is only a very short step from pretty to pretty, from picturesque to charming to quaint to twee. Hence, as John MacArthur argues, many think of the picturesque with a tinge of disgust, as a too easy reconciliation of past and present, a cloying whiff of potpourri that is trivial, sentimental, and ultimately disgusting. Much of this aesthetic disgust is class scorn, as smug as such scorn tends to be, but there is a real venom to it too, and or an unease undermining the superiority scorn demands. This gives the anti-picturesque animus an anxiety of embattlement. The sense that in the picturesque might be a threat. Because the brutality that undergirds the gaze of the picturesque is not restricted to taking an imaginary mallet to a displeasingly unfucked temple in a sketch. John Ruskin excoriates the picturesque ideal as an eminently heartless one. The lover of it seems to go forth into the world in a temper as merciless as its rocks, All other men feel some regret at the sight of disorder and ruin. He alone delights in both. It matters not of what. The shattered window, opening into black and ghastly rents of wall, the foul rag or straw wisp stopping them, the dangerous roof, decrepit floor and stair, ragged misery or wasting age of the inhabitants, all these conduce, each in due measure, to the fullness of his satisfaction. What is it to him that the old man has passed away in his 70 years in helpless darkness and untaught waste of soul? The old man has at last accomplished his destiny, and filled the corner of a sketch where something unsightly was wanting. Ruskin's denunciation of the aestheticizing picturesque is bracing, but it does not go far enough, or address the beam in its own eye. It is not a criticism of the picturesque tout court, but of its most vulgar iterations, which he calls the lower picturesque, and to which, as part of a shout-out to Turner, he counterposes the noble picturesque, one of the crucial elements of which is that of knowing. The picturesque here is unconscionable insofar as it is unconscious. The noble picturesque does understand the reality on which it gazes. It is acutely aware of suffering, of poverty or decay nobly endured by unpretending strength of heart, nor only unpretending but unconscious. The unconscious returns, but whereas in the lower picturesque it is in the gaze, for the noble picturesque it must be in at what the gaze knowingly gazes, the unconscious confession of the facts of distress and decay, no pity asked for, nor contempt feared. The gazer should feel sympathy, perhaps even, with suitable propriety, donate to charity or some such. But though the noble picturesque is melancholy, as MacArthur points out, it is still predicated on the naturalization of poverty, misery, distress, and decay. If anything, perhaps even more so. Anne Birmingham traced the relationship of the picturesque to the enclosures, the mass expropriation of common land for private landowners. In its celebration of the irregular pre-enclosed landscape, the picturesque hearkened back nostalgically to an old order of rural paternalism, she writes, idealized a nature that was in fact rapidly vanishing, sentimentalized the loss of agrarian paternalism, mystified the agency of social change so that fate, and not the economic decisions of the landowning class, seemed responsible. In this respect, the picturesque represented an attempt to wipe out the fact of enclosure and to minimize its consequences. Paradoxically, those very enclosures that it sentimentally obscured could be the mechanisms by which the picturesque spread. In 1816, Humphrey Repton published Fragments on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening. He included a before and after picture of the view from his Essex garden, artfully constructed with paper folds, to show precisely how he made it picturesque by enclosing common land. By the appropriation of 25 yards of garden I have obtained a frame to my landscape. By the planting of that garden, Repton, he was able to hide the butcher's shop that displeased him, and, pointedly, to preclude the poor, in his before picture a disabled beggar, from coming close to his garden and so much as seeing it. All because, when his view looks as if it belonged to another, it robs the mind of pleasure derived from appropriation. It is not that with these improvements Repton is able to forget the poor and the shop. He draws attention to what he has hidden, and how he has hidden it. The obscuring is visibly invisible. He can now pretend the poor are not there while knowing they are. This picturesque Tory gaze is not only expropriating and exclusionary, though it is that, as aware of distress and decay as is Ruskin, but without even the melancholy with which Ruskin excuses that awareness, it is sadistic. It does not forget, it remembers to efface. The disgust the picturesque evokes is multifarious. Righteous unease at this obfuscatory aestheticizing maneuver, and unease at the returned repressed itself, the abject reality the picturesque disavows. The unease, the eerie, the uncanny, The horror of the picture skew, then, is not some alien infection. It is there in the picturesque itself. The picture skew is the picturesque with its viewpoint moved a hair to one side or the other, so what the constructed view obscures is just visible again. The picturesque itself made abject. The picture skew sees not what this picturesque misses, but what it unsees. Distinct from the ostentatious shock value of the undercut picturesque, as in the Hammer House of Horror, or in the subtler constructed unease of the too close picturesque attention, as in Berberian Sound Studio, the insight that there is no picturesque without picture skew, or vice versa, is particularly evident in pieces wherein the eeriness and anxiety are vivid but seem not to be deliberately or overtly deployed. They, above all, are picturesque and picture skew at once. Nowhere is this imbrication more clear than in works for children. As Jeremy Fisher gazes skyward on a picturesque little river, the ravening rises from the abyss. For the writer Sarah Lotz, it was the most full-on torture-porn horrifying of Potter's works, The Tale of Samuel Whiskers, that provoked horror and awe. In fact, all Potter's astonishing works are picture skew, combining echt English picturesque with ruthless unsentimentality about the brute cruelty in its details unto death. All that violence, secret and unsecret, unseen. And yet, the picture skew's horror is not only in such disavowed brutality, the returned, but in the eruption of something more vast and alien and weird, a groping for the sublime of which it is uneasy relation. Perhaps the evasive specificity of the eerie is that it mediates those two tendencies, of the repressed and unimaginable, unsublatable as they are. Because what the skewed picturesque sweats is not only the uncanny, but the abcanny. The great horror writer Ramsey Campbell tells in My Roots Exhumed of his introduction to supernatural horror. As a very young child, he read a Rupert Bear annual containing the story Rupert's Christmas Tree, which tree uproots itself, stalks home through the woods at night. The panel that was altogether too much for me, he says, shows the tree clinging with claw-like roots to a rock against a moonlit sky and leaning towards Rupert. Rupert's pages are full of chthonic unquiet. They are full of figures as weird and terrifying as that ambulatory tree. They are stalked by Raggedy, the avatar of unfriendly undergrowth. They hint at hedgerow gnosis, and repeatedly they tip into the existentially destabilizing dark sublime. Nutwood is a place of the most thoroughgoing and frankly twee picturesque, and it borders an infinite void. There have been at least 2 comics introducing Mary Tortell's bear to Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, and the joke is funny enough, but if it lands with something of a thud, that is not because it is too much of a stretch, but because it is not. Because it did not really need saying. These days, if the great 19th century nature writer Richard Jefferies is celebrated, it is for his 1885 post-apocalyptic After London. But his neglected children's book, Wood Magic, from 1881, is a foundational text of the picture skew. A vivid depiction of a country boy growing up in a Wiltshire farm, communing with animals and landscape, it is also an extraordinary vicious fable of war and revolution in the undergrowth, of savagery, and the wrenching sublime of space-time. As the 2 armies of King Kapchak the magpie and Chu-Hu the wood pigeon meet, an eclipse occurs. Bucolic brutality and the bleak infinite combine in this child's bedtime story, hurtling towards horror. Already the advancing hosts seemed to feel the shock of combat when a shadow fell upon them, and they observed the eclipse of the sun. Till that moment, neither the rank and file nor the leaders had noticed the gradual progress of the dark semicircle over the sun's disk. The ominous shadow fell upon them, still more awful from its suddenness. A great horror seized the serried hosts. The prodigy in the heavens struck the conscience of each individual. With one consent they hesitated to engage in carnage with so terrible a sign above them. In that sidereal horror, what breaks through the cracks in the picture skew is a void of dread and inhuman deep time, amoral infinities or worse. In the countryside, remembered Alison Utley, this feeling of the proximity of another world than ours always pervaded me. I might be seized by a tree's long branches and held captive. I might enter a rock and have to stay there for 1,000 years. I was invisible and aware of other invisible shapes around me, claiming me. The top of Enid Blyton's faraway tree reaches into strange lands, but, as one character warns, sometimes the lands aren't very nice. Once there was the land of bad temper. That was horrid. And a little while ago, there was the land of smacks. In the canopy of the picturesque tree are entire ontologies of rage and pain. This should be no surprise. From its birth, recall, the picturesque was conceived as a mediation between the paltry beautiful and the awesome real behind our symbolic order, the unrepresentable, the unthinkable, beyond language. Another poem from the sequence, from 1953. No trace of fear, a capful of crabs ormering under a Dutch roof. Mountains cast their shadows, an otter in Assam smocks, and smocking gannets on Elsa Crag. Cornish mows when carters cry, a fruit grower's diary. Delightful horror, said Burke, is the most genuine effect and truest test of the sublime. Delightful? Perhaps. For Schopenhauer it was caused by the sight of a power beyond all comparison superior to the individual, and threatening him with annihilation, a mere magnitude in space and time whose immensity reduces the individual to naught. How can the picturesque carry out its task to mediate the everyday with that? It cannot, of course. There is no mediation, no trace of fear, the poem insists, protesting too much, as questioningly convincing as is Burke's delightful. After all, mountains, those paradigmatic locales of the sublime, cast their shadows. The best that the picturesque can do is attempt a holding position, and it will be unstable and sublime-stained. Uvedal Price, sharper than Gilpin, knows this. The limbs of huge trees shattered by lightning or tempestuous winds are in the highest degree picturesque, but whatever is caused by those dreaded powers of destruction must always have a tincture of the sublime. Ruskin goes further. In a brilliant, horrifying phrase, he calls the picturesque parasitical sublimity. The picturesque is picturesque that knows it is a parasite. We see this parasitism in the repeat appearance, in picturesques, of a generally very saccharine Pan. Most embarrassing is The Piper at the Gates of Dawn chapter of The Wind in the Willows, which tries to gloss the sublime as a kind of ecstatic twee. The rich meadow grass seemed that morning of a freshness and a greenness unsurpassable. Never had they noticed the roses so vivid, the willow herbs so riotous, the meadow sweet so odorous and pervading. In midmost of the stream, embraced in the weir's shimmering arm spread, a small island lay anchored, fringed close with willow and silver birch and alder. Ratty and Mole saw the friend and helper, saw the backward sweep of the curved horns, saw the stern, hooked nose between the kindly eyes that were looking down on them humorously, while the bearded mouth broke into a half-smile at the corners. And so, lengthily on. But the sublime will not be domesticated. Even here comes terror. "Afraid," says Ratty. "Of him? Oh, never, never. And yet, oh, Mole, I am afraid." And there is just a glint, familiar to readers of that sadistic visionary Arthur Machen, of his most unsaccharine, monstrous, great god, Pan. The sublime will always push through, and the picture will skew. The sequence of untitled poems that have punctuated this piece are from a magazine started in 1927 by J. Robertson Scott, and still publishing today. The Countryman is now a glossy monthly with a circulation of 23,000, full of photos of idyllic villages, curio-mongering about historic farming techniques, chit-chat on English folklore and nature. In The Making of English National Identity, Krishan Kumar says the journal did much to spread, not necessarily intentionally, the idyllic image of the countryside for the townsmen. Not intentional at first, certainly. Scott was a thoughtful reformist editor who had written excoriatingly on rural working conditions, and who described his own commitment to the country as not a devotion to a scenic and airy annex to the towns, the abode of an interestingly bucolic and out-of-date folk, which was so pleasant to recreate in. He was committed to rural sociology, education, agriculture, the rural advance, as well as to countryside aesthetics. But the Second World War changed the nature of those things, and, vastly, of the land ownership on which they were based. As the picturesque modernizers planned townscape in The Bride of Denmark, the countryman, too, anxiously, slowly began its own change. In every number, Scott wrote in 1947 in his farewell as editor, the Countryman has tried to give its town readers a sense of the countryside beyond the picturesque. But the aspiration was beyond, rather than without. Because though it might hope to exceed it, it could not escape the picturesque, and as the balance between the country as workplace and home and that of scenery shifted, the Countryman shuffled slowly towards a new role as a minor part of the heritage industry, and the maw of a picturesque. But the poems quoted come from early in the tenure of the second editor, John, son of Stafford, Cripps, in those transformative post-war days when its picturesque was contested and anxious and violently skewing. Here are those three exemplary poems once again. A Novelist and His Pears. In Istrahall, the skin-yard bats on the bottle, rescuing the past. Aunt Emily Goes to St. Kilda, duping the cuckoo people of the land. A Cotswold Rarity, The Road to the Workhouse. Christmas. Postman Mouse, watching the map-maker trails of a barnstormer. Poor Men's Flowers, Schoolhouse Ghost. Rook Parliaments taking risks with food, bees, and their scents. A Persian Half-Hour. No Trace of Fear, a capful of crabs ormering under a Dutch roof. Mountains cast their shadows, an otter in Assam's smocks, and smocking gannets on Ailsa Crag. Cornish mows when carters cry, a fruit grower's diary. Their author is History and Contingency. These fractured, trenchant, modernist, skewed investigations of the bucolic are the magazine's contents lists, made poems by the gaze alone. Unaltered, but for punctuation. From the late 1940s through the 1950s, issue after issue of The Countryman, just below its minatory B-movie title subhead, Comes from the Country, presented such texts. The bricolage of the troubled countryside, straining against its own picturesque, making these most poignant found picture skews. Here is one last authorless poem, perhaps the most extraordinary of the collection, an early specimen from 1949. Roses, castles, and lozenges, the other Garden of Eden. Man against ants, badger funerals. Too many ministries? Peruvian lilies highland holiday, no digging and all that. Are the small villages threatened? Let us attempt a reading. Lozenges, a heraldic term, the sign of a widow. We open, then on sweet pastoral smells, antique defenses, and on loss, those who lament, who have been left behind by death. From there a veer and pitch to avoid, a shadow theology of simulacrum Godhead, the other Garden of Eden, the sublime made not for us. And that garden is, all gardens are, violent, harrowed not by a snake, but by man against ants, a war of human and the alien, the carapist. Then, a space, a breath, and here is memento mori, a necro-pastoral, the beast ceremonials of those badger funerals. Too many ministries? In the aftermath and shadow of world-racking conflict, The land itself is godsick, with a surfeit of numinous, Peruvian lilies, Highland holiday. The picturesque and skew goes international, global, precisely beyond control or design as the empire itself declines, from which ruling class melancholy there can be no escape, no vacation, because a jaunt will only take you to the top of this little island itself. No digging and all that. The injunction dies away as soon as it is spoken, in the uncertainty and exhaustion of new agriculture, shamed, all countryside opinions now always already cliché. And then come a heartbreaking query. The fear of the eradication of this dream England that is dead but will not die. The terror of the end of the picturesque expressed in the picturesque, gnawing at itself, an autophagus picturesque becoming picturesque. Are the small villages threatened? Yes. Yes, they are threatening and threatened by what they were picturesque to hide and by the sublime on which they parasitize that skews them. They are threatened. And if they are not yet as dead as that widow's husband, the small villages are always already dying. That was Skewing the Picture by China Miéville. Read by Kevin Zorn.